The rain hammered against the rooftop like bullets, each drop exploding into tiny fragments that caught the dim streetlight below. Detective Sarah Martinez crouched behind the concrete ledge, her rifle steady despite the storm raging around her. Through her scope, she could see the warehouse windows 300 yards away, dark except for the faint glow of cigarette embers moving back and forth like fireflies in the night. "Target acquired," she whispered into her radio, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "I have a clear shot on the primary suspect." The voice that crackled back through her earpiece was sharp with authority. "Negative, Martinez. Stand down. That is a direct order." Sarah's finger hovered over the trigger. She had been a police sniper for 8 years, and, in all that time, she had never disobeyed a direct command. But tonight was different. Tonight, 3 innocent children were trapped inside that warehouse with a man who had already proven he would kill without hesitation. The whole situation had started 12 hours earlier when Sarah was sitting in her small apartment, trying to enjoy a rare quiet evening. She lived alone in a modest place on the east side of the city, where the rent was cheap and the neighbors minded their own business. The walls were bare except for her police academy graduation photo and a picture of her younger brother Tony in his military uniform. Tony had died in Afghanistan 3 years ago, and Sarah kept his photo there to remind herself why she became a cop in the first place. Her phone buzzed at exactly 9:30 that evening. The caller ID showed her captain's number, which never meant good news during off-duty hours. "Martinez, we need you downtown. Emergency situation developing." Captain Reynolds was a man of few words, especially during crisis situations. He had been her commanding officer since she joined the SWAT team, and Sarah respected him more than any other person in the department. But she could hear something different in his voice tonight, a tension that went beyond the usual stress of police work. "What's the situation, Cap?" "Marcus Webb broke out of county lockup 6 hours ago. He's barricaded himself in the old Morrison warehouse on 5th Street. And, Sarah." The captain paused, which was unusual for him. "He has hostages. 3 kids." Sarah felt her blood turn cold. Marcus Webb was a name every cop in the city knew. He had been arrested 2 months ago for the brutal murder of a convenience store clerk during a robbery gone wrong. The clerk was only 19 years old, barely out of high school, working nights to pay for college. Webb had shot him twice in the chest over $37 and a pack of cigarettes. During his trial, Webb had made threats against the judge, the prosecutor, and several police officers involved in his arrest. He claimed that if he ever got out, he would make them all pay. The judge had called him a dangerous sociopath and sentenced him to life without parole. But, somehow, Webb had managed to escape during a routine transfer to the state penitentiary. Sarah threw on her gear and drove through the empty streets toward the warehouse district. The radio chatter filled her car with updates that made her stomach tighten with each passing minute. Webb had taken the children from a nearby playground where they had been playing after dark, despite their parents' warnings to come home. The kids were only 8, 10, and 11 years old, too young to understand the danger they were in, but old enough to be terrified. When Sarah arrived at the scene, the entire block had been cordoned off with yellow tape and police barriers. Patrol cars lined the streets with their red and blue lights painting the buildings in alternating colors. SWAT vehicles were positioned at strategic points, and officers in full tactical gear moved with practiced precision despite the chaos of the situation. Captain Reynolds met her at the command post, a large mobile unit that served as the nerve center for major operations. Inside, multiple screens showed aerial views of the warehouse, building schematics, and live feeds from surveillance cameras that had been hastily positioned around the perimeter. "What do we know about the layout?" Sarah asked, studying the building plans spread across a table. "The Morrison warehouse has been abandoned for 3 years, Reynolds explained, pointing to different sections of the blueprint. 3 floors, multiple access points, but Webb has barricaded most of them. He's holding the kids on the 2nd floor in what used to be the main office area." Detective Mike Torino, Sarah's usual spotter and longtime partner, looked up from a laptop computer. "We've been monitoring his phone calls. Webb is demanding a helicopter, $50,000, and safe passage to Mexico. He claims he'll release the children once he's across the border. Sarah had worked with Mike for 4 years, and they had developed the kind of trust that only comes from facing life and death situations together. He was a former Marine who had served 2 tours in Iraq before joining the police force. His steady demeanor and sharp analytical mind made him the perfect spotter for sniper operations. "Do we believe him?" Sarah asked. Captain Reynolds shook his head grimly. "Webb's psychological profile suggests he's a narcissistic personality with violent tendencies." Dr. Patricia Hoffman from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed his case file. Her assessment is that he'll likely kill the hostages regardless of whether we meet his demands. Dr. Hoffman was a small woman with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, but her reputation in law enforcement was legendary. She had profiled some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, and her insights had saved countless lives over her 20-year career with the Bureau. "Webb feels betrayed by the system," Dr. Hoffman explained to the assembled team. "His escape was carefully planned, and taking these specific children wasn't random. He chose kids from the neighborhood where the convenience store clerk lived. This is about revenge and control." The negotiation team had established contact with Webb through a phone line that ran into the warehouse. For 3 hours, they tried every technique in their training manual. They offered him food, medical attention, and opportunities to speak with family members. But Webb's demands remained the same, and his threats against the children became increasingly violent as time passed. Sarah positioned herself on the roof of a building directly across from the warehouse. From her vantage point, she had a clear view into the second-floor windows where Webb was holding the hostages. Through her high-powered scope, she could see him pacing back and forth, occasionally stopping to shout at the children who sat huddled together in a corner. "I can take the shot," she reported to Captain Reynolds over the radio. "Clean line of sight, minimal risk to the hostages." But the captain's orders were clear: maintain surveillance only. The FBI had jurisdiction over the situation, and their protocol called for continued negotiation attempts. Agent Patricia Mills, who was leading the federal response, believed they could still resolve the situation peacefully. Agent Mills was young for such a high-profile assignment, probably in her early 30s, with blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She had a reputation for successfully negotiating the release of hostages in similar situations, but she had never dealt with someone like Marcus Webb. As the hours passed, Sarah watched through her scope as the situation inside the warehouse deteriorated. Webb's behavior became more erratic and aggressive. He struck one of the children for crying too loudly, and Sarah could see the fear in all 3 kids' faces even from her distant position. "He's losing control," she reported. "The children are in immediate danger." But, still, the order came back: hold your position. Do not engage. Sarah's radio crackled with updates from the negotiation team. Webb was no longer answering their calls consistently, and, when he did speak, his demands had escalated. He now wanted $1 million and a private jet. His threats against the children had become specific and graphic, describing exactly what he would do to them if his demands weren't met. Mike Torino climbed onto the roof to join Sarah at her position. He carried additional equipment, including a thermal imaging scope that could detect heat signatures through the warehouse walls. The technology allowed them to track movement inside the building even when they couldn't see through the windows. "How are you holding up?" Mike asked as he set up his equipment. "I'm fine," Sarah replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Being a police sniper meant carrying the weight of life and death decisions, but this situation felt different. Usually, there was a clear protocol to follow, a chain of command that made sense. Tonight, Sarah found herself questioning whether following orders was the right thing to do. "Talk to me," Mike said quietly. He had learned to read Sarah's moods during their years as partners, and he could sense her internal struggle. "Those kids don't deserve this," Sarah said, never taking her eye away from the scope. "Webb is going to hurt them regardless of what we do. I can end this right now." Mike nodded slowly. He understood the position she was in, but he also understood the consequences of disobeying direct orders. "What does your gut tell you?" Before Sarah could answer, a scream echoed across the empty street from the warehouse. Through her scope, she saw Webb grab the youngest child, an 8-year-old girl with pigtails, and drag her toward the window. He held a gun to her head while shouting something at the police officers below. "I need authorization to take the shot," Sarah said into her radio, her voice tight with controlled urgency. The response came immediately, negative. "Stand down. That is a direct order." Sarah's training had taught her to trust her superior's judgment, to follow the chain of command even in the most stressful situations. But her experience had also taught her to recognize when a situation was beyond saving through conventional means. As she watched Webb terrorize the children, she realized that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. The warehouse district around them was completely empty except for law enforcement personnel. The old industrial buildings cast long shadows in the streetlights, creating a maze of dark alleys and hidden corners. This part of the city had been abandoned by legitimate businesses years ago, leaving behind a wasteland of broken windows and rusted fire escapes. Sarah thought about her brother Tony and the stories he used to tell about making split-second decisions in combat situations. He once told her that the hardest part of being a soldier wasn't facing the enemy, it was knowing when to trust your instincts over your orders. "Sometimes you have to choose between being a good soldier and being a good person," Tony had said during his last visit home. "And sometimes, if you're lucky, those two things are the same." Through her scope, Sarah could see Webb becoming more agitated by the minute. He was no longer just holding the children hostage, he was actively terrorizing them, using their fear as a weapon against the police negotiators. The thermal imaging confirmed that he had positioned himself near explosive devices he had brought into the warehouse, making any assault by ground forces extremely dangerous. "Captain," Sarah said into her radio, "I'm seeing something through the thermal scope. Webb has what appears to be explosives rigged throughout the office area. If SWAT tries to breach, he could detonate them." There was a long pause before Captain Reynolds responded. "Confirmed. Bomb Squad has identified the signatures. This changes our tactical assessment." Agent Mills' voice came through the radio, "That makes negotiation even more critical. We cannot risk setting him off." But Sarah could see what the others couldn't. Webb's body language, his positioning relative to the explosive devices, the way he handled his weapon, everything pointed to a man who had already decided how this situation would end. He wasn't planning to escape. He was planning to take everyone with him, including the children. "He's not planning to leave that building alive," Sarah reported. "This is a suicide mission for him." The rain continued to pound the rooftop around her, soaking through her gear and chilling her to the bone. But Sarah remained perfectly still, her rifle trained on the target, waiting for the right moment. She had made thousands of practice shots in similar conditions, and her accuracy record was among the best in the department. Mike checked his watch and made another entry in his logbook. They had been in position for over 6 hours, and the strain was beginning to show on everyone involved in the operation. Down in the street, she could see SWAT team members rotating shifts to maintain peak readiness, but, for Sarah and Mike, there would be no relief until the situation was resolved. "Weather's getting worse," Mike observed, wiping rain from his thermal imaging scope. "Wind is picking up from the northeast at about 15 miles per hour, with gusts up to 25. Sarah made the necessary calculations in her head, adjusting her aim to compensate for the environmental factors. The distance to target was manageable, but the weather conditions added complexity to what should have been a routine shot. At 3:47 a.m., everything changed. Webb appeared in the window with the oldest child, an 11-year-old boy, and pressed his gun against the child's temple. Through the radio communications they had intercepted, it became clear that he was giving the negotiators a final ultimatum: meet all his demands within 10 minutes, or he would start executing the hostages one by one. "Stand down, Martinez," came the immediate order from Captain Reynolds. "I repeat, stand down. That is a direct order." But, as Sarah watched Webb's finger tighten on the trigger, she knew that following orders would mean watching 3 innocent children die. In that moment, 8 years of training, discipline, and respect for authority collided with a simple moral truth: sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do. Sarah took a deep breath, steadied her rifle, and made a choice that would change everything. The moment Sarah's finger pulled the trigger, time seemed to stop. The sound of the rifle shot echoed through the empty streets like thunder, followed by the distinctive crack of breaking glass. Through her scope, she watched Marcus Webb's body jerk backward and crumple to the floor of the warehouse office. The weapon fell from his hand and clattered across the concrete, finally coming to rest near a pile of old shipping crates. Shot fired! Shot fired! Mike Torino shouted into his radio, his voice cutting through the stunned silence that had settled over the command post. Target is down. Repeat, target is down. The radio exploded with chatter as every unit on the scene tried to report in at once. Sarah remained motionless behind her rifle, watching through the scope as the three children scrambled away from Webb's motionless body. She could see them crying and holding each other, but they were alive and apparently unharmed. Martinez, what the hell did you just do? Captain Reynolds' voice boomed through her earpiece, a mixture of anger, shock, and something that might have been relief. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was still focused on the warehouse, making sure there were no other threats and that the children remained safe. Through her scope, she could see SWAT officers already moving toward the building, their tactical gear clearly visible as they approached the various entry points they had identified hours earlier. Children appear to be unharmed, Sarah finally reported, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what had just happened. All three hostages are mobile and moving away from the suspect's location. Agent Patricia Mills' voice came through the radio, sharp with fury. Officer Martinez, you have just compromised a federal investigation and potentially endangered the lives of those hostages. You were given explicit orders to stand down. But, even as Agent Mills spoke, the SWAT team was already inside the warehouse. Team leader Sergeant Rodriguez reported over the radio that they had secured the scene and were evacuating the children. The explosives that Webb had rigged were confirmed to be real, but they had been set up with a dead man switch that required Webb to actively trigger them. With Webb dead, the devices were no longer an immediate threat. Sarah finally lifted her head from the rifle scope and looked at Mike. Her partner's face showed a mixture of admiration and concern. They both knew that what Sarah had just done would have consequences that went far beyond the successful rescue of three children. How do you feel? Mike asked quietly. Ask me tomorrow, Sarah replied, beginning the process of securing her weapon. Her hands were steady, but she could feel the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by the weight of what she had done. Down in the street, Sarah could see the children being let out of the warehouse by paramedics and SWAT officers. Even from her distant position, she could tell they were traumatized but physically unharmed. The youngest girl was crying and clinging to one of the officers, while the two boys walked close together, looking around nervously as if expecting another threat to emerge from the shadows. The ambulances that had been standing by for hours finally had patients to treat. Sarah watched through binoculars as the paramedics examined each child, checking for injuries and signs of shock. The children's parents had been waiting behind the police barriers all night, and she could see them running toward the ambulances as soon as the all-clear was given. Romeo 6 to all units, came Sergeant Rodriguez's voice over the radio. Scene is secure. All hostages are safe and accounted for. Suspect is deceased. Beginning crime scene protocol. Sarah began packing up her equipment, but she knew her night was far from over. Within minutes, she would have to face Captain Reynolds, Agent Mills, and probably a dozen other officials who would want to know exactly why she had disobeyed a direct order. The fact that her decision had saved 3 lives would matter, but it wouldn't make the consequences disappear. Mike helped her carry the equipment down from the roof. As they walked through the empty building toward the street, neither of them spoke about what had just happened. They both understood that everything was about to change, and there would be plenty of time for talking in the hours and days ahead. When they emerged from the building, Sarah was immediately surrounded by officials. Captain Reynolds was the first to approach her, his face showing a complex mixture of emotions that Sarah couldn't quite read. Sarah, he said, using her first name instead of her rank, which was unusual for him during official operations. We need to talk. Now. Agent Mills was standing nearby with 2 other FBI officials whom Sarah didn't recognize. Their expressions made it clear that they viewed her actions as a serious breach of protocol that could have had catastrophic consequences. From their perspective, Sarah had acted like a loose cannon who couldn't be trusted to follow orders. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the FBI behavioral analyst, approached the group with a tablet computer in her hands. She had been monitoring the situation from the command post, and her expression was more thoughtful than angry. "Before anyone says anything they might regret," Dr. Hoffman said, "I think you all need to see this." She turned her tablet screen toward the group, showing a video feed that had been recorded from one of the surveillance cameras inside the warehouse. The footage showed Webb's final moments, including audio of what he was saying to the children. "This was recorded 30 seconds before Officer Martinez took her shot," Dr. Hoffman explained. Mr. Webb was telling the children exactly what he planned to do to them before killing himself. "Based on his body language and the positioning of the explosive devices, I can confirm that he had no intention of releasing those hostages alive." The video was difficult to watch. Webb's threats were graphic and specific, and it was clear that he was working himself up to follow through on them. The children's terror was obvious, and even the hardened law enforcement officials gathered around the tablet found the footage disturbing. "Officer Martinez's assessment of the situation appears to have been correct," Dr. Hoffman continued. "Mr. Webb was in the final stages of what we call a murder-suicide sequence. He was going to kill those children within the next few minutes, regardless of any negotiation efforts." Agent Mills studied the video footage for several moments before responding. "That may be true, Dr. Hoffman, but it doesn't change the fact that Officer Martinez disobeyed direct orders and took unauthorized action during a federal operation." Captain Reynolds stepped forward, and Sarah could see that he was struggling with his own conflicted feelings about the situation. "Agent Mills, with all due respect, Officer Martinez has been an exemplary member of this department for 8 years. Her judgment in tactical situations has always been sound." "That's not the issue here, Captain," Agent Mills replied. "The issue is chain of command and proper protocol. If every officer decides for themselves when to follow orders and when to ignore them, we have chaos instead of law enforcement." Sarah listened to the debate swirling around her, but her attention was drawn to the ambulances where the children were being treated. She could see the youngest girl talking to a female paramedic, and, for the first time since the ordeal began, the child appeared to be smiling. The two boys were sitting together on the back of an ambulance, drinking hot chocolate that someone had provided. Detective Mike Torino moved closer to Sarah and spoke quietly. "Internal Affairs is going to want to interview you first thing in the morning. Captain Reynolds is trying to minimize the fallout, but there's going to be an investigation." Sarah nodded. She had expected as much. Police officers who discharge their weapons are always subject to investigation, and officers who disobey direct orders face disciplinary action regardless of the outcome. The fact that she had done both simultaneously meant she was looking at serious consequences. "The union rep is already on his way," Mike added. "Don't say anything to anyone without him present." Officer Jim Bradley from the police union had represented Sarah during a minor disciplinary hearing 3 years earlier when she had been accused of using excessive force during an arrest. The charges had been dropped when video evidence proved that she had acted appropriately, but Bradley had been professional and effective throughout the process. As the crime scene investigation got underway, Sarah found herself standing apart from the main group of officials. She was still part of the operation, but her status had clearly changed. She was now both a hero who had saved 3 lives and a problem that the department would have to deal with. Dr. Hoffman approached her privately while the other officials continued their discussion about proper protocol and jurisdiction issues. "Officer Martinez," Dr. Hoffman said, "I've been doing this kind of work for 20 years, and I've seen situations like this before." "You made the right call." "Tell that to Agent Mills," Sarah replied. "Agent Mills is good at her job, but she's never had to make the kind of split-second decision you made tonight. It's easy to follow protocol when you're not the one looking through the scope." Dr. Hoffman paused and glanced toward the warehouse where Webb's body was being photographed and documented by the crime scene investigators. Marcus Webb was what we call a family annihilator personality type. He blamed society for his problems, and he wanted to make sure his final act would cause maximum pain to the community he felt had wronged him. "So you're saying he was always going to kill those kids?" "Based on every indicator we have, yes." The negotiation was just theater for him. He was enjoying the power he had over everyone's emotions, but he never intended for anyone to leave that building alive. Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. While she had been confident in her assessment of the situation, hearing confirmation from a respected professional helped validate her decision. But she also knew that being right wouldn't necessarily protect her from the consequences of disobeying orders. The children's parents had finally been allowed to approach the ambulances where their kids were being treated. Sarah watched as tearful reunions took place under the bright lights that had been set up around the crime scene. The relief on the parents' faces was evident even from a distance, and several of them were openly crying as they held their children. Maria Santos, the mother of 8-year-old Isabella, walked over to where Sarah was standing. She was a small woman in her 30s, wearing a hospital scrubs that suggested she had been called away from work when the crisis began. "Are you the officer who took the shot?" Maria asked, her English heavily accented but clear. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied. Maria hugged her without warning, holding on for several seconds before stepping back with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for bringing my baby home." Similar scenes played out over the next hour as other family members approached Sarah to express their gratitude. The parents didn't care about protocol or chain of command. They only cared that their children were alive and safe, and they understood that Sarah's decision had made that possible. Captain Reynolds finally called Sarah over to the command post trailer where Agent Mills and the other federal officials were conducting their preliminary review of the incident. "Officer Martinez," Agent Mills began, "you'll need to provide a detailed statement about tonight's events. The FBI will be conducting a thorough investigation into this incident, and your cooperation will be essential." "I understand," Sarah replied. "You should also know that the U.S. Attorney's Office will be reviewing this case to determine if any federal charges are warranted. Interfering with a federal investigation is a serious matter." Captain Reynolds stepped forward. "Agent Mills, I think that's premature. Officer Martinez's actions resulted in the successful rescue of 3 hostages and the elimination of a dangerous fugitive. That should count for something." "Captain, I understand your desire to protect your officer, but we cannot allow local law enforcement to simply ignore federal authority whenever they disagree with our tactics." The debate continued for another 30 minutes, with various officials weighing in on different aspects of the situation. Sarah listened but didn't participate unless directly asked a question. She understood that her fate was being decided by people with competing interests and different perspectives on what had happened. As dawn began to break over the city, the crime scene investigation was winding down. Webb's body had been removed, the explosive devices had been safely disarmed, and the warehouse had been thoroughly documented. The children had been released from the hospital after being examined and were finally going home with their families. Sarah was told to report to headquarters at 10 o'clock that morning for the beginning of the formal investigation process. She would be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of both the internal police investigation and the federal review. "How long does this usually take?" Sarah asked Captain Reynolds as they walked toward their respective vehicles. "Depends on how cooperative everyone wants to be," he replied. "Could be a few weeks, could be a few months. The important thing is that you did the right thing tonight, regardless of what happens next." Sarah drove home through the empty streets as the sun came up over the city. The radio news reports were already covering the story, though the details were still sketchy and some of the information was inaccurate. What mattered was that 3 children who had gone to sleep in their own beds the night before were now safely back with their families. When she got to her apartment, Sarah sat on her couch and looked at the photo of her brother Tony in his military uniform. She thought about their last conversation before he deployed to Afghanistan, when he had talked about the difficulty of making moral choices in impossible situations. "You can't always do what's right according to the rules," Tony had told her. "Sometimes you have to do what's right according to your conscience, and then live with the consequences." Sarah realized that she was about to learn exactly what Tony meant. 3 weeks after the warehouse incident, Sarah sat in a sterile conference room on the 14th floor of the federal building downtown. The internal affairs investigation had concluded, and now she faced the FBI's formal review board. Across from her sat Agent Mills, two other federal prosecutors, and a stern-faced woman from the Justice Department who had introduced herself as Deputy Attorney General Catherine Walsh. The union representative, Jim Bradley, sat beside Sarah with a thick folder of documents and legal precedents. He had been preparing her case for weeks, gathering witness statements, expert testimony, and character references from her 8 years on the force. The folder represented hundreds of hours of work, but Sarah wasn't sure it would be enough to save her career. Officer Martinez, Deputy Attorney General Walsh began, "You understand that you are here because your actions on the night of October 15 constitute a potential violation of federal law. Specifically, you interfered with a federal investigation and ignored direct orders from federal agents." "I understand the charges," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the knots in her stomach. Over the past 3 weeks, Sarah's life had been turned upside down. The media had picked up the story, and she found herself at the center of a national debate about police authority, federal jurisdiction, and the use of deadly force. Some commentators praised her as a hero who had saved 3 innocent lives. Others criticized her as a rogue cop who couldn't follow orders. The police department had placed her on administrative leave with pay pending the outcome of the federal investigation. She spent her days in her apartment, watching news reports about her own case and trying to understand how her split-second decision had become a national controversy. The 3 children she had saved were recovering well from their ordeal, according to reports from the victim advocacy services. 8-year-old Isabella Santos had been having nightmares, but she was working with a counselor and showing signs of improvement. The 2 boys, Michael Chen and David Rodriguez, had returned to school and were reportedly doing well with the support of their families and teachers. "Let's review the timeline of events," Agent Mills said, opening a laptop computer and projecting a detailed chronology onto a wall-mounted screen. At 21:30 hours on October 14, Marcus Webb escaped from county custody during a routine transfer. At 23:45 hours, he took 3 children hostage at the Morrison warehouse. Sarah had heard this timeline dozens of times during the internal investigation, but she listened carefully as Agent Mills continued. Federal agents assumed jurisdiction of the case at 0:15 hours on October 15, at which point all local law enforcement personnel were instructed to follow federal protocols and commands. At 3:47 hours, you discharged your weapon despite explicit orders to stand down. "That's correct," Sarah acknowledged. Deputy Attorney General Walsh leaned forward in her chair. "Officer Martinez, help us understand your thought process in that moment. What made you believe you had the authority to override federal commands?" Sarah had anticipated this question and had spent weeks thinking about how to answer it honestly. "I didn't believe I had the authority to override federal commands. I believed I had a moral obligation to save 3 innocent lives. But, you understand that law enforcement agencies cannot function effectively if individual officers simply ignore orders whenever they disagree with them?" "Yes, ma'am, I understand that. But, I also understand that those 3 children would be dead right now if I had followed orders." Jim Bradley placed a hand on Sarah's arm, a subtle reminder to be careful about how much she said. They had discussed this moment extensively, and he had warned her that anything she said could potentially be used against her if criminal charges were filed. Agent Mills clicked to the next slide in her presentation, which showed a photograph of Marcus Webb's body as it had been found in the warehouse. "Officer Martinez, you couldn't have known with certainty that Mr. Webb would have killed those children. Our negotiation team was still actively working to resolve the situation peacefully. With respect, Agent Mills, I could see what was happening through my scope. Webb was in the final stages of carrying out his plan. He had already told the children what he was going to do to them." Dr. Patricia Hoffman, who was present as a witness rather than an investigator, spoke up from the back of the room. "If I may interject, Agent Mills, our post-incident analysis supports Officer Martinez's assessment. The behavioral indicators all suggested that Mr. Webb was past the point of negotiation. Dr. Hoffman, your analysis is valuable, but it was conducted after the fact. Officer Martinez had to make her decision based on incomplete information." Sarah felt frustration building inside her chest. The information wasn't incomplete. I could see Webb holding a gun to a child's head. I could hear him making specific threats over the radio intercepts. I could see the explosive devices positioned throughout the room. What more information did I need? Deputy Attorney General Walsh made notes on a legal pad while Sarah spoke. Officer Martinez, let's talk about your training and experience. How many times have you fired your weapon in the line of duty? 3 times, including this incident. And the other 2 occasions? Both were armed suspects who posed immediate threats to civilians. Both were cleared by internal investigations as justified shootings. Jim Bradley pulled a document from his folder and slid it across the table. Deputy Attorney General Walsh, this is Officer Martinez's complete service record. In 8 years, she has received commendations for bravery, marksmanship, and community service. She has never been disciplined for excessive force or failure to follow orders. Sarah appreciated Jim's efforts, but she could tell that the federal officials were focused more on the precedent her case might set than on her individual record. If they allowed her actions to go unpunished, it might encourage other officers to second-guess federal authority in future situations. Let's talk about the aftermath, Agent Mills continued. Are you aware that your actions could have triggered the explosive devices that Mr. Webb had rigged throughout the warehouse? Yes, I was aware of that possibility. But the thermal imaging showed that the devices were set up with a dead man switch. Webb had to actively trigger them, which he couldn't do if he was incapacitated. You were gambling with the lives of those children based on your interpretation of thermal imaging. Sarah felt her patience wearing thin. I was gambling with the lives of those children either way. If I took the shot, there was a small chance something could go wrong with the explosives. If I didn't take the shot, there was a certainty that Webb would kill them within minutes. The questioning continued for 3 hours, with breaks every hour for the officials to confer privately. Sarah answered every question as honestly as possible, but she could sense that the federal prosecutors had already made up their minds about her case. During one of the breaks, Jim Bradley walked with Sarah to a small break room where they could speak privately. How do you think it's going? Sarah asked. They're in a difficult position, Jim replied. Politically, they can't be seen as being too soft on an officer who ignored federal authority. But, legally, they know that any charges they bring will be difficult to prosecute given the outcome. What do you think they'll do? My guess is they'll offer some kind of plea deal. Maybe a misdemeanor charge with probation and a requirement that you resign from the force. Sarah had been expecting something like that, but hearing it out loud still hit her hard. Being a police officer wasn't just her job, it was her identity. The idea of giving it up, even though she had saved 3 lives, felt like punishment for doing the right thing. When they returned to the conference room, Deputy Attorney General Walsh was reviewing a thick legal document with the other prosecutors. Agent Mills was on her phone, speaking quietly with someone who was apparently at FBI headquarters in Washington. Officer Martinez, Deputy Attorney General Walsh said, "We've been in contact with our superiors, and we're prepared to make you an offer." Sarah braced herself for what she knew would be a difficult choice. "We're willing to reduce the charges to a single misdemeanor count of interfering with a federal investigation. You would receive 2 years of probation, perform 200 hours of community service, and resign from the police force. In exchange, we would not pursue felony charges that could result in significant prison time." Jim Bradley immediately began taking notes, but Sarah was focused on the phrase "resign from the police force." Everything else was manageable, but losing her career felt like losing herself. "How long do I have to consider the offer?" Sarah asked. 72 hours, Deputy Attorney General Walsh replied. "If you decline, we'll proceed with filing felony charges." The meeting concluded with handshakes and formal pleasantries, but Sarah felt like she was walking through a fog as she left the federal building. The offer meant she could avoid prison, but it also meant giving up the career she had worked 8 years to build. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment going through old photo albums and police academy materials. She found her graduation certificate, signed by the police commissioner who had since retired, and a letter of recommendation from her first sergeant that had helped her get promoted to the SWAT team. Her phone rang at 8 o'clock, and the caller ID showed Captain Reynolds' number. "Sarah, how did it go today?" they offered me a deal. Misdemeanor charge, probation, community service, and resignation. There was a long pause before Captain Reynolds responded. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that 8 years of my life just got reduced to a plea bargain. Sarah, I want you to know that the department is behind you. We've been getting calls from all over the country, other police departments, federal agents, military personnel. A lot of people think you did the right thing. But, not enough people in the Justice Department. Captain Reynolds sighed. Politics is a complicated thing. The feds are worried about setting a precedent, but they also know that prosecuting you for saving 3 kids' lives is going to be a public relations nightmare. So I'm caught in the middle. Yeah, you are. But, Sarah, remember that those 3 children are alive because of your decision. Whatever happens with your career, that's something no one can take away from you. After she hung up the phone, Sarah walked to her window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Isabella Santos was probably getting ready for bed in her own room instead of lying dead in a warehouse. Michael Chan and David Rodriguez were probably doing homework or playing video games instead of being buried in unmarked graves. The next morning, Sarah received an unexpected visit. Maria Santos, Isabella's mother, was standing in the hallway outside her apartment with a small gift bag in her hands. Mrs. Santos, Sarah said, surprised to see her. How did you find my address? I asked around, Maria replied with a smile. Cops talk to each other, and, eventually someone told me where you live. Sarah invited her inside, and Maria sat on the couch where Sarah had been wrestling with her decision for the past 18 hours. I heard about the government wanting to charge you, Maria said. Isabella hears things too, even though we try to protect her from it. She wanted me to give you this. Maria handed Sarah the gift bag, which contained a hand-drawn picture. It showed a police officer with a rifle standing on top of a building, with 3 stick-figure children standing safely below. At the bottom, Isabella had written thank you in careful 8-year-old handwriting. She talks about you every day, Maria continued. She calls you her guardian angel. I don't understand why they want to punish you for saving my daughter. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she studied Isabella's drawing. The little girl had drawn the police officer with a big smile, and she had colored her hair the same brown color as Sarah's. Mrs. Santos, I want you to know that even if I have to leave the police force, I don't regret what I did. Your daughter and the other children deserve to go home safe. What will you do if you can't be a police officer anymore? Sarah had been asking herself the same question. I don't know yet. Maybe I'll find another way to help people. They talked for another hour, and Maria shared stories about how Isabella was recovering from her ordeal. The little girl was brave and resilient, but she still had occasional nightmares about the warehouse. She was working with a counselor, and Maria was confident that she would eventually put the trauma behind her. After Maria left, Sarah called Jim Bradley to discuss the federal offer in more detail. He explained the legal implications of each option and helped her understand what her life would look like under both scenarios. If you take the deal, Jim said, you'll have a criminal record, but you'll avoid prison and you can start rebuilding your life immediately. If you fight the charges, you could win, but you could also face several years in federal prison. What would you do in my position? Honestly? I'd probably take the deal. It's not fair, but fair doesn't always matter in the legal system. That evening, Sarah drove to the cemetery where her brother Tony was buried. She sat by his headstone and told him about the situation she was facing. She had always been able to talk to Tony about difficult decisions, and even though he was gone, she found comfort in sharing her thoughts with him. I know you'd probably tell me to fight, she said to the headstone. You never backed down from anything, even when the odds were against you. But this feels different. I can't win by fighting the system, I can only lose less. As she sat in the gathering darkness, Sarah thought about Tony's final letter home, which had arrived 2 weeks after the military notification of his death. In it, he had written about the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult or dangerous. But he had also written about choosing your battles wisely and understanding when tactical retreat was the better option. Tony had been a warrior, but he had also been a strategist who understood that sometimes the best way to continue fighting was to live to fight another day. By the time Sarah drove home that night, she had made her decision. Sarah walked into the federal building for the final time as a police officer. She wore her dress uniform, with all the commendations and awards she had earned over 8 years of service. If this was going to be the end of her law enforcement career, she wanted to face it with dignity and honor. Jim Bradley met her in the lobby with the signed plea agreement in his briefcase. They had spent the previous evening going through every detail of the document, making sure Sarah understood exactly what she was agreeing to and what it would mean for her future. "Are you sure about this?" Jim asked as they rode the elevator to the 14th floor. "No," Sarah replied honestly. "But I'm sure that I can't spend the next 5 years in prison fighting a system that's already made up its mind." The same conference room held the same officials, but the atmosphere was different this time. The formal questioning was over, and now they were simply completing a legal transaction that would close the case and allow everyone to move on. Deputy Attorney General Walsh reviewed the terms of the plea agreement one final time. Sarah would plead guilty to one misdemeanor count of interfering with a federal investigation. She would serve 2 years of probation, complete 200 hours of community service, and resign from the police force effective immediately. "Officer Martinez," Deputy Attorney General Walsh said, "do you understand the terms of this agreement, and do you enter into it voluntarily?" "Yes, ma'am, I understand and I agree to the terms." The paperwork was signed, witnessed, and filed. Just like that, Sarah's career in law enforcement was over. She was no longer Officer Martinez, she was just Sarah, a 32-year-old woman with a criminal record and an uncertain future. Captain Reynolds was waiting outside the federal building when Sarah emerged. He had attended the hearing as a show of support, even though his presence wasn't required. Sarah appreciated the gesture, especially since she knew he was facing political pressure from city officials who wanted to distance themselves from the controversy. "How are you holding up?" he asked as they walked toward the parking garage. "Ask me in a year," Sarah replied, echoing what she had told Mike Torino on the warehouse rooftop 3 weeks earlier. "Sarah, I want you to know that you'll always have a place in this department if circumstances change. This case isn't over just because you signed that agreement." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "What do you mean?" "There are people working on this situation at levels above my pay grade. Political people, legal people, people who understand that what happened to you isn't right. It might take time, but there could be opportunities to appeal or reverse some of these consequences." Sarah wanted to feel hopeful about Captain Reynolds' words, but she had learned over the past 3 weeks that the legal system moved slowly and often in unpredictable directions. For now, she needed to focus on rebuilding her life outside of law enforcement. The media attention had continued throughout the legal proceedings, and Sarah found herself at the center of a national debate that extended far beyond her individual case. Civil rights groups argued that she had been scapegoated by federal officials who were more concerned with protecting their authority than acknowledging the reality of her impossible situation. Law enforcement organizations were divided in their response. Some supported Sarah's actions and criticized the federal prosecution, while others maintained that discipline and chain of command were essential to effective policing. The debate played out in newspapers, on television talk shows, and in congressional hearing rooms where politicians used her case to advance their own agendas. Sarah tried to avoid most of the media coverage, but it was impossible to escape entirely. Her phone rang constantly with requests for interviews, and reporters had started showing up at her apartment building. She eventually hired a publicist to handle the media attention and help her control the narrative around her story. The community service portion of her sentence turned out to be more meaningful than Sarah had expected. She was assigned to work with a nonprofit organization that provided support services to families of crime victims. The work allowed her to use her law enforcement experience to help people navigate the criminal justice system and connect with resources for recovery and healing. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, who ran the Victim Services Program, became both Sarah's supervisor and her mentor. Dr. Rodriguez was a former prosecutor who had left the legal profession after becoming disillusioned with the way the system treated crime victims. The irony of your situation, Dr. Rodriguez told Sarah during one of their weekly meetings, is that you're probably helping more people now than you ever could have as a police officer. Sarah wasn't sure she agreed with that assessment, but she had to admit that the work was fulfilling in ways she hadn't expected. She counseled families who had lost loved ones to violence, helped children who had witnessed traumatic crimes, and assisted elderly victims of financial scams navigate the complex process of seeking justice. One of her first clients was a family whose teenage son had been killed in a drive-by shooting 6 months earlier. The parents were struggling with their grief while also trying to understand the legal proceedings against their son's killer. Sarah's law enforcement background allowed her to explain the investigative process and help them prepare for the emotional challenges of attending court hearings. "You understand this world in a way that most people don't," the boy's mother told Sarah during their third meeting. "You've seen it from the inside, so when you tell us something, we know you're not just giving us false hope." Sarah found that her experience on both sides of the criminal justice system as a law enforcement officer and, now as someone who had been prosecuted, gave her a unique perspective that helped her connect with crime victims. She understood the frustration of dealing with bureaucracy, the fear of an uncertain outcome, and the feeling of being powerless within a system that seemed indifferent to individual suffering. 6 months after her resignation from the police force, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the FBI behavioral analyst who had supported her during the federal investigation. "Sarah," Dr. Hoffman said, "I have a proposition for you. The Bureau is looking for someone to develop training programs for law enforcement officers who work in hostage and crisis situations. Your experience and perspective would be invaluable." Sarah was surprised by the offer. "Dr. Hoffman, I'm not sure the FBI would want someone with a criminal record developing their training programs. Actually, that's exactly why we want you. We need someone who understands the real-world pressures that officers face in these situations, someone who can help us develop protocols that are both tactically sound and morally defensible." The position would be as a civilian contractor rather than as a federal employee, which meant Sarah's criminal record wouldn't be an automatic disqualifier. The work would involve traveling to different law enforcement agencies around the country, conducting training sessions, and helping develop new approaches to crisis negotiation and tactical decision-making. "I need to think about it," Sarah said. "Take all the time you need." "But, Sarah, this could be a way for you to continue serving in law enforcement, just from a different angle." That evening, Sarah called Captain Reynolds to discuss the FBI offer. He was enthusiastic about the opportunity and encouraged her to seriously consider it. "Sarah, this could be your chance to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to other good officers," he said. "If you can help develop better protocols for these situations, you could save careers and lives." Sarah also discussed the offer with Dr. Rodriguez, who had become an important advisor and friend. Dr. Rodriguez encouraged Sarah to pursue the opportunity, but she also wanted to make sure Sarah understood the potential challenges. Working with law enforcement again could be emotionally difficult, Dr. Rodriguez warned. "You'll be constantly reminded of what you lost, and you'll be working with people who might judge you based on your criminal record. But it could also be a way to turn this whole experience into something positive," Sarah replied. Sarah spent 2 weeks considering the FBI offer. She visited the 3 children she had saved, who were all doing well in their recovery. Isabella Santos had started taking martial arts classes and talked about becoming a police officer when she grew up. Michael Chan and David Rodriguez had both returned to normal childhood activities and seemed to have processed their trauma in healthy ways. Seeing the children reminded Sarah that her decision on that rainy night had been the right one, regardless of the legal consequences. These 3 young people were alive, healthy, and building bright futures because she had chosen to trust her instincts over her orders. Sarah accepted the FBI position and began her new career as a law enforcement trainer and consultant. Her first assignment was to develop a case study based on her own experience, examining the decision-making process that led to her actions and the lessons that could be learned for future crisis situations. The case study became part of a training program that was eventually adopted by police departments across the country. Sarah's story was used to teach officers about the importance of situational awareness, the challenges of working within federal jurisdiction, and the moral dimensions of tactical decision-making. 1 year after the warehouse incident, Sarah was conducting a training session at the police academy when she noticed a familiar face in the audience. Mike Torino, her former spotter and partner, was attending the session as part of his continuing education requirements. After the training session, they met for coffee to catch up on their respective lives. "How are you adjusting to civilian life?" Mike asked. "It's different," Sarah replied. "But I think I'm making a bigger impact now than I ever did as a patrol officer. The department misses you. It's not the same without you on the team." Sarah appreciated the sentiment, but she had come to terms with her new reality. "Maybe this is where I was always supposed to end up. Maybe everything that happened was just leading me to this point." Mike updated her on developments within the police department. Agent Mills had been transferred to a different division within the FBI, and there were rumors that her handling of the warehouse case had been criticized by her superiors. Captain Reynolds had been promoted to deputy chief, and he continued to speak publicly about the need for better coordination between federal and local law enforcement. "There's something else you should know," Mike said. "The families of those 3 kids have started a scholarship fund in your name. They're raising money to help other police officers get advanced training in crisis negotiation and tactical decision-making." Sarah was touched by the gesture. The scholarship fund represented a way for the community to honor her sacrifice while also investing in better training for future officers who might face similar impossible decisions. 2 years after accepting her plea agreement, Sarah had completed her probation and community service requirements. Her criminal record remained, but she had built a new career that allowed her to continue serving the law enforcement community in a different capacity. She received invitations to speak at police academies, federal law enforcement conferences, and university criminal justice programs. Her story had become a case study in ethical decision-making under pressure, and she used her platform to advocate for better training, clearer protocols, and stronger support systems for officers who found themselves caught between competing demands. Sarah often thought about the moment on the warehouse rooftop when she had to choose between following orders and following her conscience. The consequences of that decision had reshaped her entire life, but she never regretted the choice she had made. In quiet moments, she sometimes wondered what would have happened if she had followed orders that night. 3 families would be grieving instead of celebrating their children's achievements. 3 bright futures would have been snuffed out by a man's desire for revenge. The world would be a darker place, and Sarah knew she would have carried that knowledge for the rest of her life. Instead, Isabella Santos was thriving in middle school and still talked about becoming a police officer. Michael Chen had discovered a talent for music and was learning to play the violin. David Rodriguez had joined his school's debate team and was developing into a confident public speaker. These 3 young people represented the best possible outcome of an impossible situation, and their success validated every sacrifice Sarah had made. She had lost her career, her pension, and her clean criminal record, but she had gained something more valuable, the knowledge that when faced with the hardest decision of her life, she had chosen correctly. The rain still reminded her of that night on the rooftop, but it no longer brought sadness or regret. Instead, it reminded her that sometimes the most important decisions are made in the most difficult moments, and that doing the right thing isn't always the same as following the rules. Sarah Martinez had learned to live with the consequences of her choice, and, in doing so, she had discovered that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out who you really are.